like to turn to the Psalms. We'll begin with Psalm 42. We'll be looking at some different verses in the Psalms. But in Psalm 42, verses 1 and 2, as the hart, H-A-R-T, it's a deer, panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. My soul thirsteth for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? Psalm 63, we'll read the first two verses. O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power and thy glory, so as I have seen thee in the sanctuary. Psalm 73, verse 25. Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire beside thee. Psalm 143, verse 6. I stretch forth my hands unto thee. My soul thirsteth after thee, as a thirsty land, Selah. What we read in Psalm 42, we know not the author. We do not know the author of the 42nd Psalm. What we read in Psalm 63 and Psalm 143, those were words that were penned by David. And what we read in Psalm 73 are the words of Asaph. We want to take our thought for the message in Psalm 42, verses 1 and 2. So panteth my soul after thee, O God. My soul thirsteth for God. In Psalm 63 and verse 1, my soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth for thee. Psalm 73, 25, whom have I in heaven but thee? There is none upon earth that I desire beside thee. Psalm 143, verse 6, I stretch forth my hands unto thee. My soul thirsteth after thee. In each of these statements, the psalmist is speaking to God. He's talking to God. And he is expressing the longing of his heart for God. Each of these statements that we've made reference to, what we see here is a heart for God. A heart for God. In each of these statements that we've called your attention to is a heart passionately engaged for God. That's a rare thing. It's always been a rare thing, but it's rare to meet an individual who truly has a heart for God, whose heart is truly engaged for God. So these words are emblematic of a yearning, a craving, a hunger, again, a heart for God. So panteth my soul after thee, O God. My soul thirsteth for God. My soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth for thee. Whom have I in heaven but thee? There is none upon earth that I desire beside thee. How many people can honestly say that? There is none upon earth that I desire beside thee. There is nothing upon earth that I desire beside thee. I believe the times are rare that we can honestly say that. I stretch forth my hands after thee, my soul thirsteth for thee. These words are all descriptive of a heart that has an appetite for God, a preference for God. All of these words reveal a preference for God. Most of God's people cannot honestly say that they have a preference for God. That'd be a downright lie. It means that there's an attraction to God, an inclination toward God, an infatuation, an obsession with God. These words are all descriptive of a fervor and an enthusiasm for God. Again, a heart for God. A heart taken up with God. A heart under the control, under the influence of God. A heart being impacted by God. So our subject is a heart for God life. A heart for God life. First thing we want to consider is the root of the life that we are called to live requires a heart for God. Requires it. For us that are saved, the life that we are called to live, to simplify it, is simply a life for the Lord. We're not called to merely a way of thinking, though this life we're called to affects our thinking. We're called to a way of living. The life that we're called to live is a responsibility. It's each one of our responsibilities. It's a duty. It's a function. It's how we're to function. It involves a right position. You have to be in a right position to live this life. Requires a proper motive. And it's all in relation to God. Everything about this life that we're called to live relates to God. It is a life that involves surrender to God. It's a life that involves nonconformity to the world. It is a life that involves transformation and renewal of the mind. And each and every element of this life is to be cheerful and is to be voluntary, and it's all for God. It's all for Him. The life that we're called to live involves a dependence upon God. It involves a closeness to God. Again, it involves submissiveness to God. It involves obedience. And it includes the enjoyment of God. The enjoyment of God. How many of God's people truly enjoy God. It's a life above the world. It's a life of loyalty to God. It's a life that must have right values, right concerns, right pursuits. And absolutely necessary to this life is a heart for God. What we are called upon to be, what we are called upon to do, requires a heart for God. I'm not talking about a heart, or I am talking about a heart that God has laid hold of. It's a heart that has been seized by God. It is a heart that is being constantly drawn to God. What we're talking about is a feeling, but it's more than feeling. It's a feeling, it's an emotion for God that is beyond human description. It's beyond our ability to define. But the Bible's very plain. God requires the heart. Absolutely requires it. The heart has reference, of course, to our inner being, our entire inner being. It's who we are. These bodies are just the houses that we live in. But who we are is defined by the heart. It is that which gives character to all that we do. It's the thoughts. It's the motions. It's the affections of the will. It's the will of man. It's the soul of man. We hear the Lord say in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might." And Jesus said in Matthew 22:38, "This is the first and great commandment. This commandment is greater than all. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart." In Psalm 119 and verse 12, we're told, "Seek him with the whole heart." With the whole heart. Jeremiah 29, verse 13, "And ye shall seek me and find me when ye shall search for me with all your heart." So while the tendency of religion is to put the emphasis upon the outward, the Lord puts the emphasis upon the heart of man. We need to hear Proverbs 23:26 as coming from God to us individually. "My son, give me thine heart. Give me thine heart." You can give the Lord some of your time. You can give the Lord some of your money. That's not what he asks for. He says, "Give me thine heart." In a day, it can't be argued, in a day when so many, I would say the vast majority of God's people are traveling the wrong road. They're going the wrong way. They've moved away from God. They're trusting in the arm of flesh more than God. They're bowing to the images, the gods of self-interest and self-gratification. And they're being mesmerized by the world. And they're entangled in the affairs of life. And their minds are clouded with the philosophies and the reasonings of the wicked. And they're stuck in a state of spiritual decline, a state of coldness, and a state of apathy. And they find themselves at a great distance from God. Actually, their lives are detached. Their minds are detached from God. In such a day, oh, how we need a heart for God. And in such a day, those who have such a heart, you'll be so different than everybody around you. You won't have to say a word and people know that's an odd duck there. A heart taken up with God. We live in a day when, again, someone might say, well, have you taken a survey? No, I don't have to. All you got to do is look around. Most have little to no appetite for spiritual things. There's little desire for God, little zeal for God. And the things of God have become quite mundane. And God's been dismissed from the lives of His own people. We need a heart for God. A heart taken up with God. We live in a day when God's people are oblivious to God. They're ungrateful. They have fallen for the procedures and the techniques of man. They have fallen into the traps of Satan. And their lives are simply engulfed with worldly mindedness, prayerlessness, selfishness, idolatry, pride, ingratitude, for many bitterness and anger and jealousy and all the pettiness. All the pettiness. The spiritual immaturity and the spiritual inability and what I call habitual hypocrisy. It's habitual. It's what they do. Do-it-yourself religion. Emergency religion. We need to be a people that have a heart for God. A heart that is taken up with God. There's no doubt today that the great majority of God's people are more invested in the world than they are spiritual matters. Their priorities are in the world rather than spiritual matters. They're more dictated by the world than they are by the spiritual. And their form of service, for the most part, is mechanical. It's empty. It's a mere formality. Oh, Brother Dan, you don't think much of modern Christianity. Bingo. I sure don't. I sure don't. Lives are filled with lip service, religious platitudes. You hang around a Baptist church long enough, you hang around those who profess to be God's people, you learn how to speak the language. Just because you can speak the language doesn't really mean a thing. We need to be a people with a heart for God. The lives of most, their lives are more characterized by unbelief than they are by faith. Their lives are more characterized by worry than it is contentment. And their lives are more characterized by frustration than peace and contentment. And their lives are more characterized by discouragement and misery than joy. More characterized by doubt than conviction. We need a heart for God. A heart taken up with God. We're surrounded on all sides by filth and by the vileness and by the wickedness and abomination, the blasphemy and the heresy of a world that hates God. And we need a heart for God. A heart taken up with God. The Lord does not think very highly of mere service. He demands the heart. We hear him in Isaiah 29:13. He said, "For as much as this people draw near me with their mouth, and with their lips they do honor me, but have removed their heart from me." They say the right things. They even appear to do the right things. But they have removed their heart from me. It's not that their heart has been removed from Him. They have removed their heart far from me. And their fear or their reverence toward me is taught by the precept of men. Their lives had come to the point where their service was simply by the precepts and the ideas of man, and without heart. They just become machines. God's people do not get into a state of spiritual decline because things did not go well for them. They do not get in a state of spiritual decline because they lost their job or because they've had a failed personal relationship. They do not get into a state of spiritual decline because of some financial problem or because of sickness or because of mistreatment or because of trials. That's not why God's people get in a state of spiritual decline. They get in a state of spiritual decline because they've lost their heart and passion for God. And therefore they can't deal with these other things. And they begin to substitute things, dreams, and goals for God. So we need to make honest examination of ourselves. Do I have an everyday yearning, an everyday craving for God? Now, I did not ask, do you have a yearning and a craving for spiritual things? That's not what I asked. Because we can desire spiritual things without and leave God out of it. Do we have a craving for God Himself? So when I say a heart for God, I'm talking about something beyond religion, spiritual automation and formality. We're talking something about beyond outer show, beyond the occasional. So we need to ask ourselves, is the attraction, is the bent of my soul toward God? It's really not a difficult question to answer. The answers are really pretty plain. The difficulty comes in with whether or not we're willing to be honest. There's the difficulty. Is God the driving force of my life? This is what a heart for God is. Again, God demands all thine heart, the whole heart. So let's consider some distinguishing marks of a heart for God. First of all, a person with a heart for God has had a person-changing, mind-altering, life-changing experience of salvation. You can't have a heart for God without it. There has to have been a personal salvation experience. A momentous, a consequential experience. An encounter with God has taken place. A God-produced miracle of transformation has taken place. Can't have a heart for God without it. There is no heart for God without the impact of salvation, without the impact of God upon our lives. A heart for God means that we have been profoundly affected by God, but that also continues. It didn't stop. It didn't stop. So we must ask ourselves, to what degree has God and does God impact my life? To what degree does He influence my life every day? What bearing does He have upon my daily life? The answer to those questions determine whether or not we have a heart for God. A person with a heart for God knows Him. They know God. They know Him personally. And a person with a heart for God has some understanding of who God is, what God has done. But this is more than intellectual. It is more than theological. It is more than a religious knowledge of God. Because you can have all those things and not have a heart for God at all. You can have all of those things and not have an interest in God. A person with a heart for God has a knowledge that is personal. It's a confidence. It's an assurance. It's a persuasion and a conviction concerning the person of God. But it's more than that. It's an experience, an ongoing experience, an ongoing close association with God. It's an ongoing personal contact with God. an ongoing friendship and kinship with God. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about a knowledge of God. It is a knowledge of relationship. It's a knowledge of ongoing relationship. It's a personal recognition of God in our lives. He's reality in our lives. He's relevant. He's a relevant force in the everyday life of the one who has a heart for God. So do we possess this personal knowledge of God in our everyday lives? Is God relevant in our everyday lives? A person with a heart of God has a personal love for Him. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, I love the Lord. Some people even say, I love the Lord with all my heart. But look at their lives. That's a lie. That's a lie. But a person with a heart for God has a personal love for Him. And it's a love that is fervent. It is a love that's intense. It's without reservation. It consumes our life. It's a love that's willing to give all. I don't believe that any of us really can give all. But we certainly ought to be willing to give all. It's a love that can endure all. Goes all the way. I've often asked, how far are you willing to go? Oh, I'm willing to go all the way. Now, think about that question. Don't just say, oh, I'm willing to go all the way. Because you're probably not. But we need a love that endures all, that is willing to go all the way. A love that fills us with wonder concerning Him. A love that sees His beauty, His magnificence. It is a love that continually draws us to Him. Moves the heart and thrills the soul. And it's again a direct result of a personal experience of His love. You cannot have a heart for God if you do not have a personal love for Him. You cannot have a heart for God if He is not the love of your life. It's more than just loving Him. He has to be the love of our life. That is, we love Him more than anyone else. And people will readily say, oh yeah, I love the Lord more than anybody. Then why do you constantly choose others over the Lord? Because you don't love the Lord more than anybody. That's easy to say. But just saying it does not make it so. A heart for God does not allow our love to Him to become stifled. And we've got to guard against our love losing its glow, its wonder, its passion, its excitement. Love grows cold. But a heart for God will not allow that to happen. A person with a heart for God is possessed by a delight in God. They delight in God. They find great pleasure in the person of God. He's the song of their heart. It's not just songs about God. He is the song of the heart The person with a heart for God does not merely endure the circumstances of life, but he finds jubilance in the person, in the will, in the ways, in the Word of God. They live life celebrating God, regardless of the circumstances. A heart for God will celebrate God. A heart for God will relish the things of God. A heart for God is possessed with a desire for God. There's an inclination toward God. There's a determination for God. A heart for God is set apart for God and is separated from the principles and the behavior and the philosophies and the reasonings and the ways and the pursuits of the world. You see, a person who has a heart for God has made Him their life. He's their life. He's the priority of their life. Many times, God's people are put in a situation where they have to choose between God and something else. I dare say we're put in that situation every day. But a person who has a heart for God doesn't say, well, this is a very difficult decision for me to make. If you have a heart for God, there's nothing difficult about it. Well, I've got to give it some thought. If you have a heart for God, there's nothing to think about. It's God. Don't have to think about it. It's God. He's the priority. The reason people have to think about it, but they're more spiritual than that. Well, I got to pray about it. Don't even need to pray about it. If it's God or something or somebody else, there's nothing to pray about. Other than God make our hearts right. But a heart for God doesn't have to think about it. He's the meaning of their life. Their identity is in Him. He's the center. He's the core of what they do and how they think. He's the goal. He's the aim of life. A person with a heart for God desires to live supremely for God, wholeheartedly for God, continually for God. They are steadfastly minded for God. Other things don't get in the way because their heart is consumed with God. Causes our lives to be intertwined with Him, weaved to Him. So again, we must ask ourselves and make honest examination. Is God the priority of my life? Or do I allow other things to compete with God? A person with a heart for God has a seriousness about God. There's a seriousness about God. Life is not all about good times. Life's about God. And you ought to have a good time with that. But a person with a heart for God is serious about God. They lean upon Him. They depend upon Him. They feed upon Him. They're willing to relinquish all for God. They're willing to stoop and forget about self because they have this heart for God. They have a humble spirit. They're teachable. They're teachable. People will say all the time, well, I'll never go there. I'll never move there, or whatever. Doesn't matter what happens. I'm not doing that. Well, what if God tells you to? Need a heart for God. There are a lot of things people don't even consider because they're comfortable. Heart for God means that we're willing to use whatever we have in His service. We're willing to be whatever we need to be for His honor and for His glory. Everything's for His honor, for His glory. A person with a heart for God is sensitive to God. Remember Elijah? God showed up in Mount Carmel in a powerful way. Elijah runs for his life because of the message of Jezebel. And he finds himself sitting under a juniper tree, feeling sorry for himself. Remember, God said, God's not in the wind, but a still small voice. God doesn't always have to, for a person who has a heart for God, appear on the mountaintop in fire. All he has to do is whisper. And a person with a heart for God responds. They respond. Why is it so many times with so many people, God has to show up in a chariot of fire for them to see? Because they're oblivious to God. Because they have no heart for God. It ought to be all God has to do is whisper. All God has to do is just touch us with His finger. And we ought to respond. Heart for God is sensitive. And they cannot stand the thought of sin in their life or anything that would get in the way between them and God. Person with a heart for God, they thank God. They thank God. They praise God. They worship God in everyday life. They always want to be more. They always want to do more. A heart for God will keep our hearts soft. Will keep our hearts pliable. Will keep our hearts willing. A heart for God will keep priorities right. And a heart for God will fortify the mind. And a heart for God will revive the spirit and will give you enablement and fill you with peace and cause you to ascend above the world. And a heart for God will keep a lot of clutter out of our lives and will spare us a life of wandering and a life of emptiness and a life of defeat and a life of exasperation and unrest. You see, a heart from God will keep you from becoming entangled in the allurements and spell of the world. A heart for God will keep you from self-indulgence. It'll keep you from self-will and self-seeking and self-righteousness. A heart for God will keep us from becoming overcome with discouragement. A heart for God makes life exciting, makes it joyful. So in a day when so many have been squeezed into the mold of the world, and have lost their spiritual passion and ambition. They blame it on everything but where they really need to put the blame. And as a result, they live hopeless and frustrated lives. We need a heart for God. We need to be a people with a heart for God. We ought to long for such. We ought to plead with God to give us that heart. A heart of thanksgiving, a heart of praise, a heart of love. A heart absorbed with God. A heart absolutely taken by the one who saved our soul. This is what is required to live the life that we are called to live. It requires a heart for God. Oh, that God would give us that heart. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us